Okay, we're now live.
I think we might be live. Hopefully we are live, and hopefully there are audiences between Facebook and YouTube. My name is Carl Middleton. Welcome to Letterpress United between Facebook and YouTube. My name is Carl. Bit of an echo.
Carl, have you the Facebook page open?
Of course. Right.
Okay. Okay. The Facebook page open.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. Little bit of a delay, but nice to start season 2 with a standard amount of errors. Electra, you could.
Yeah. Hi. I'm Elettra. I'm now streaming from Rome, Italy, and happy to have you here. Hopefully, you are seeing us both on Facebook and YouTube. And of course, if you leave comments, we can reply and see. Okay, and so maybe it's just time to meet our speakers for tonight. So I'll let them in. Welcome, Ryan.
Hello, from Ann Arbor, Michigan.
And welcome, Duffy.
Hey.
Okay.
Nobody's waving back.
But we are now receiving a lot of comments and nice comments and greetings from every part of the world. Thank you. So today's topic is making type, and we're going to have 3 speakers. Unfortunately, Mark McCallier can't be here with us tonight, but he recorded a video. So first of all, we are going to display Mark's video. And so we're going to have you back later on, okay? So see you.
See you. Right, if you can you share the screen, my screen?
Not yet, Carl.
Okay, sorry.
So it's the beauty of this live thing, I guess. Okay. I'm displaying some greetings at the moment. Okay, in the meantime, I'm going to say that at the end of this episode, we are going to have a question and answer part. So you can post your questions in the comments, both on Facebook and YouTube. But keep that, if you can, keep that for the end, because at the end of the free presentation, we can have this part with our 2 live speakers, Davi and Ryan. So everything okay, Carl? Can you?
Yeah, I'm just trying to share the screen,
Okay.
And it's not allowing it for some apparent reason.
Okay, I think I'm going to share the screen. Okay.
Okay.
So.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
So this is a presentation by McCullough. Oh, I'll be quiet. I think.
Yeah. Perfect. So let's start.
Hello. Good morning. My name is Mike. Wood, the raw material. Here are my planks of 2-inch beech, and 3-inch sycamore, air dried and both cut about 10 years ago. I buy character grade wood. It has cracks, splits, etc. But as I'm using the end grain, that doesn't really matter. I also cut wood type from hornbeam, Europe's hardest hardwood. It's a beautiful wood and traditionally used for wood type by companies like De Little and Day & Collins. This is end grain beech. And this is end grain hornbeam. I also use hard maple for large type above 20 line, side grain rather than end grain. Here's a simple test to show you how hard hornbeam is. This is a piece of pine put into a nipping press with a brass stamp. And here's the hornbeam. Same process. As you can see, not a dent in sight. The key to getting type high is to use a drum sander. It consists of a spinning drum with sandpaper on and a moving belt which carries the wood underneath the spinning drum. The height of the drum sander is adjustable, and by working out what height the block needs to be to start with, I then progress through combinations of 5 grades of sandpaper, starting with 60 and ending with 800 grades. Each grade comes on a 50-meter roll, costing around £90, so it's quite a heavy investment. So I start with a block that has been routed on one side to give me a flat reference to start with. Then it is just a case of working through the grades of sandpaper to get to type high, the combinations of which took about 6 months of experimenting, and so at the moment remain a closely guarded secret. Like you, I use a type high gauge to double check it's the correct height. Next step is to seal the printing side with shellac. I could cheat and use the spray version. Next step is to polish the printing surface. I use the traditional method of boiled linseed oil and fine pumice powder. I apply using wool felt as it's slightly abrasive. I know others use steel wool. The aim is to achieve a mirror finish. So the block is made. Next step is to cut it. I use X-Carve CNC machine, which uses vector artwork. This is created in Adobe Illustrator. The vectors are created at 100% size and include the block dimensions. The example shown is Otto. The vector artwork is then converted to a code the CNC machine understands. I chose the X-Carve machine because of the software it uses. You can see how the block will look before you cut it, giving you an idea of whether the bits you're using will achieve the results you're after. I've tried and tested lots of cutting bits over the years, and these are my favourites, ranging in size from 3mm down to a tiny 0.4mm. The code is sent to the CNC machine, which controls the movement of a router. It gets very noisy in here, especially with the dust extractor going as well. There are normally 2 or 3 bit changes per letter. Here it is, cutting the fine details of 6-line Monpasi letters. And here it is with a larger bit to remove the bigger areas. I also own a 1950s Funditor printer saw, which is calibrated in points and plankers, allowing me to cut type exactly to the right height. Next step is hand finishing the block, removing any cutting burrs, etc., and cleaning up. I have various knives for doing this, and the final finishing is done with a hard toothbrush to remove all the debris. I have a large collection of type specimen books. These are a few of my favourites. The Morgan Press collection. A manual of decorated typefaces. The 1910 American Type Founders Catalogue, which is quite a monster of a book. And a rare hardback version of Rob Roy Kelly's American Wood Type. And my newest edition, a 1954 Stevenson Blake Wood Letter Catalogue. I have over 50 cases of wood type collected over the last 8 years, from 5-line height right up to 100-line height. Here are just a few of my favourites. I have 3 presses, 7x11 Cropper and Charlton treadle press, a small proofing press, and my newest arrival, a Harrow proofing press that used to belong to Her Majesty's Stationery Office, which has giant bed size of 19 by 26 inches. And means I can start using my large type collection.
Cool. It's really interesting film by Mark, and I noticed some of the comments about the timber species. So Mark was saying it is hornbeam that he uses, and in the UK, hornbeam it's really a hedging plant, but when they're left, they do grow it to tree sizes, and similarly sycamore. So they're sort of UK native species, but they do grow with a really interesting sort of tight wood grain, and they're a very, very valuable sort of resource if you're making letters. So I think we're on to the next speaker now. So the second speaker is, I'll try to pronounce his surname correctly, Ryan Malloy, is it?
Well, correct.
Cool.
Oh, sorry. Okay, here you are.
Right, over to you, Ryan.
All right. Hello, I'm Brian Malloy. I am a graphic designer, educator located in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I teach at a local university, Eastern Michigan University, in Ypsilanti, Michigan. And welcome to my basement. This is where most of my work is and where I do a good chunk of it. All of the really dirty stuff, the woodworking, I either do at the university that I work at or at in my garage where I have a drum sander like Mark just showed, and my type saw is also upstairs. Kind of a quick tour before I actually get into showing some of my kind of the tools that I work with. But in general, this is where I work. This is what happens when you have a 6'4" person using a standing desk that's kind of a makeshift thing, a CNC router with the most high-tech version of dust kind of prevention from kind of happening around. Dust collection is a critical thing if you're going to do CNC routing as well. Other than that, within my basement, let's see, Ricer printer, some other kind of fun things. And I'm gonna kind of switch cameras really quick. So hopefully this will actually work. It worked during when we were practicing. Here we go, camera. Switch to the back camera. All right, hopefully this pops on in 1 second. There we go. So like Mark, I use a variety of tools and kind of making my work happen. You can see a little bit of the different bits that I use. I'm not going to give a live CNC demo. Unfortunately, just the noise and CNCing sometimes can be really time consuming. But basically, surface planer for kind of dealing with any sort of surfacing that I need to do. I don't use this for the blocks. I just use it for what's called the spoil board. So that I can make sure that I have a level spoil board. Various V-carve bits. A lot of people ask, how do you get corners? The easiest way to get corners is using various V-carve bits. And I'll talk about a little bit about how I use these as well to kind of do some work that I'm currently doing. You know, 1/4" bits. This is actually what I use to, I use my CNC router as a block leveler, and I actually use this to level the block. You could kind of see the grain pattern a little bit. It's rather time consuming to do it this way, but I've found that there's less vibration and less error in kind of adjusting the blocks. And then various tools, cam clamps, highly useful for kind of locking things in place. These I just kind of fabricated myself. You know, bumper guides to kind of lock stuff up against. And then probably one of the most important tools, very kind of janky looking, that I've actually used is since I actually cut into the wood to often make shapes and kind of experiment with it. So you can kind of see this. And I'll show some of this type as well. But you can see where I'm doing this here. Because I'm going pretty far deep into the surface, I want to make sure that the router is plumb. And so you need a way to tram your router. So this goes into the router here, and you can kind of spin it around and adjust the height. You could also, I could also swap this out for pencil and clamp a pencil in there. Both very useful for kind of making sure that your router is plumb. And there's always going to be machine maintenance with any kind of thing that you're going to be doing. Other tools, calipers, kind of over there, you'll see a block gauge, a better block gauge, also part of my basement. Mallet, used for a variety of things, and a set of chisels, which I do for a lot of finishing. So those are kind of some of the basic tools that I use within my work. And kind of to talk a little bit, my work itself is really based on really kind of exploring how can we use these machines, whether it's digital fabrication or the devices like a CNC, to kind of bring new ways to letterpress. For me, that started with doing laser etch type. And there's a lot of testing that goes into all of this, and I'll show some of the test blocks. But for me, it kind of started with how can I really bring something new to it? We have this digital technology. So what can this digital technology do for us? How can we use this digital technology in new ways to really kind of bring new light to typography and type design, and how do we merge those sort of two things together? And so for me, it started with laser etching, mostly because that was the easiest sort of equipment I had instantly available to me. And I was working at a local makerspace as well as the institution I work at to kind of produce this work. And the first thing I decided to do was make a 2-color chromatic typeface and make it as detailed as possible. And it went through several different versions. And actually, while I like some of the letter forms, I still don't love it. But this was the first iteration. It's an 18-line chromatic typeface in which, you know, we could use sort of the tools that we can really kind of get. And so some of these lines are almost like 0.5 points, and really kind of trying to push and see how far could I kind of experiment with level of detail. How can I bring back some of, like, you look at some of those 19th century typefaces, the amount of detail that they had in wood type, and trying to bring some of that back into the discipline. And then there's things that I didn't like about this particular face, even though I really liked the counterless aspects of it. I could never resolve the heaviness of that sort of kind of focal point. And so I ended up getting rid of the counterless and added counters in there and kind of resolved it. And here again, the type is about 1 point kind of in size. And these are just some of the various test blocks and patterns that I did. And you can kind of see here, you know, anytime you're doing digital fabrication, you're going to be doing a lot of testing, testing the various power, testing the various kind of speed in which the laser is going to get. So you can see here some of the various different burns, different power settings, different speed settings. What does that do to it? The first blocks I ever produced were kind of glued together. I use end grain maple for the most part because early tests that I did with things like MDF, it worked great, but getting sort of this really fine level of detail, you would lose it quite a bit on the laser. And on the CNC too, there's a tendency for it to kind of break apart quite easily there. So it's just some ideas of, if you're going to dive into sort of playing around with digital fabrication, be prepared to do a lot of kind of testing, experimenting, playing around with it, wasting material to a degree. I mean, you could always shave this off, kind of sand it down and kind of get back to it. So that was that particular face. And one of the things I really enjoyed about making that face was the idea that because we're using digital technology, we could easily make a whole set of series of alternates and alternate characters, and we could kind of play around with, you know, since everything is almost kind of produced on demand, I could easily kind of make several different pieces at any point in time, whatever I want. So that was sort of where I started, and kind of going to jump back and forth. The amount of time it took to produce just a handful of those blocks was quite a bit, but I still wanted to push and experiment with the idea of chromatic type. And so that kind of led me to making chromatic type with halftones. And you can see here some of my test patterns and test blocks. By this point in time, I had committed to using end grain maple. This is some of the earliest stuff that I actually did the traditional method of French polishing, where you're burnishing it down and you get the mirror surface. I now just use still wool and don't get quite as nice as a finish, but it still is super functional. But you can see here just testing the threshold of what happens when I'm using certain kind of bits, V-carve bits, how long it takes. And for those that are kind of like, oh, digital fabrication is great, you could easily make this. The amount of time it takes to carve this out is probably at least 30 minutes for this square, if not longer. So my first attempt was kind of trying that technique on type, which I thought really kind of created and captured sort of a digital look and feel without doing any sort of wild split fountain kind of combinations. That then translated to a whole set of type that had basically the direction of the type moving in 8 different directions with a gradated line. This again is one of those extremely time-consuming processes. However, I think it's one of those advantages that, you know, without technology, and that has somewhat been lost. I mean, there used to be die stamping techniques, and no one really does die stamping techniques of wood type anymore. But sort of without that technology, we kind of lose that ability to do it. So finding ways to revitalize and experiment with kind of new ways of thinking about how can we experiment with chromatic typography in different ways that haven't been done before. This was kind of my attempt, and this is what it looks like printed. You can easily see that, you know, without split fountains, you kind of get this sort of wild gradient effect happening with the typography. Hopefully there we get a nice sort of detailed look of it. And so kind of moving around, after I was doing some of that experimentation as well, I got really interested in a typeface by Nesbit as well as Figgins that was called Roman Grotesque. And it sort of looked like this. This is my version. I call it, my version I call American Zigzag, just because it's slightly more extreme. Figgins' version was called English Zigzag, and actually went in two different directions. And the typeface really began, the reason why I kind of started investigating this typeface was I was very interested in how the blocks were cut. And I have yet to find an example of at least George Nesbit's version of the blocks, which were produced at a wide variety of heights. And so I set about kind of trying to figure out my own way of doing it at the same time, and really started investigating how could I use the CNC to play around with the shape of the block. And so that led to me making custom type, in which I really began to start to experiment with the shape of the block. My favorite letter, which I've never printed actually, is this Q, and sort of the backwards Q. And really kind of one of the challenges of this typeface is because there wasn't many examples in the specimen, I sort of had to kind of use other fat faces, distort them, and then sort of from that make my own version of it. The S was probably the most challenging to figure out. And so really kind of in that process of trying to figure out how does this work, also kind of thinking about how do these blocks kern, and so basically making a completely kernable version of this. I believe Figgins' blocks, since they were cast in metal, were actually cast straight and not with this kind of fun zigzag pattern. But I don't know, again, if Nesbit ever produced a full set or where it might have been or who might have used it. But so kind of diving in a little bit to history, that led me to really start to explore the shape of the block. And really kind of experiment with, well, if I could use the CNC to cut and carve into things, why can't I make type that is not straight, or make type that can be set in all sorts of different weird ways? And so really thinking about how can I experiment and set type in all sorts of different ways. Like there's no reason why I can't set type in sort of a hexagonal pattern, or straight, and printed these samples look a bit like this. And so we have kind of, you know, the type straight, but we also have the type at some wild angle. So again, like really thinking about how can we use digital technology in new sort of ways to experiment. Of course, all of these require me cutting through at least most of the block, and with a lot of trial and error. And this is some of the furniture that I use for this. You can see that I basically modeled it after those kind of kit plastic models that you have that use little tabs that you can break apart. So there's a little bit of hand finishing and trimming that goes into all of this. These are what this is kind of for, so that you can really cut into it, chisel it, clean up those edges. And it's also why it's critical that the router is plumb, is so that it kind of remains straight. So there's a lot of figuring out, again, with prototyping it. I've actually lost a lot of little pieces that kind of got thrown up out of the router as I was experimenting with this technique. So just a little bit of experimentation. And then sort of speed. Cutting some of these letters and a whole block of it can be rather time consuming. And so I started really thinking about how do I speed up the process of making type? Is there ways that I can really start to experiment with the ideas of production, speeding up production? And so as much as I love the detail on this, and there are some kind of flaws again that I didn't really love about how it kind of creates that sort of center spot. So revising the design so that it would really utilize and make use of only one bit at least for a portion of it. So this whole design is set up basically so that a 16th inch bit creates the shape of it, and then the 1/4 inch bit would come around, and you could easily see there that it routes out the entire kind of space within there, at least to a degree, and then you go in, hand trim, cut it all out, break it all apart, and in the end result, you have things like this that you could print, where it's a completely flexible system and really thinking about type in new ways. The original system, this particular ornament, I really liked the idea in which you could vary the border patterns as much as you want. So you could kind of have a wide variety of border patterns. And while this one has a tremendous amount of detail, the newest version doesn't have as much detail, but could still have that same flexibility. And I also liked the chromatic possibilities of this. And so how can we really kind of experiment and create weird sort of versions of op art, experimenting, kind of thinking about, again, all of this is sort of tied into what does digital technology lend to this particular practice of making type? In addition to that, along with sort of making these, started making some ornaments that were also based in that hexagonal pattern. Those ornaments in particular just printed on top of each other. This one does have a split fountain to kind of get that gradated effect, but you can really see the flexibility that one might have in sort of typesetting some sort of wild system using these non-traditional ways of making type. Outside of that, since all of this is so time consuming, I spend a lot of time often thinking about how can I make type faster. For those that really want to get into type making, the CNC, depending on how fast you want to get, Mark might be able to talk about that, or anybody who's fabricated with the CNC, particularly highly detailed work. It's not a fast process. You're constantly gauging the speed at which you can kind of move a bit through there. And so sometimes the pantograph actually is probably faster to make stuff. And in my kind of efforts to really explore some of the ideas about making efficiency, I started cutting blocks to just a specific size and width, and then channeling my deviant youth of graffiti writing at times, started tagging within the software, and then just carving that space out. Really thinking about, okay, well, tagging is about efficiency and speed. How can I bring that into maybe using the CNC, making type a little bit more gestural? This is what it looks like sort of printed on top of each other, or at least the whole font of it. Really thinking about, again, what sort of systems can I use to bring new ways of thinking about type, or how can we think about type in different ways? And then also a quick experiment of it in sort of gold and silver on black, playing around with ideas of transparency and whatnot. That experiment in speed and efficiency, and all of this kind of is all tied together and being developed almost at the same time, led me to create this particular typeface. This entire typeface is all based on the idea of being created by a 16th inch bit. I'm running out of space here. So that the idea in which we can really play around with this notion of creating type, the entire typeface is just designed for the path in which the tool can path, and then a clearing path around it. So really thinking about, and this is something that we could technically then translate if we really wanted to designing patterns for a pantograph, depending on the scale and size. This particular smaller size just uses the V-carve bit. You can see really kind of tiny there, how that looks. And so thinking about also how do we scale based on the tool size. So we have a V-carve bit, and then we have just our normal kind of flat and 16th inch bit. What that looks like in the file is a little bit of the opposite. And so it's cutting out everything but the actual letter. And so these are the tool paths that I use and create. So in Illustrator, It's all sort of prototyped by playing around with the width of those, and that's what kind of then creates it. So the tool itself will kind of move on the outside, and that's what carves away that portion. And then the gray is just a big sort of clearing path area. Printed, this particularly looks like this. And a lot of it's really thinking about how can I, again, use the machine language to make type, and what is that connection between the machine and type itself. And so that's the work there. This particular typeface I have yet to complete, partly because there's a lot of testing too of what does it look like printed? Do I really love this proportion? Do I like how this is looking? Do I enjoy it? I have yet to resolve how the S looks. I'm not in love with the B as well, some spacing issues here and there. And also really thinking about just the optical kind of considerations of how do we bring in all of those things about type and type design into sort of merging them with the technology. How do we kind of experiment with that? And then that, similar to that, again, with this idea of a single line, I do a lot of experimenting with sort of playing around with also using the CNC as a pen plotter at times. And the idea of something being maybe versatile and using sort of the pen plotter or taking ideas of like a brush pen and applying that to CNC and making type with it. And that sort of has kind of led me to experimenting with things that kind of work in both sorts of ways. So we have something like this here where it's kind of carving into the space. And it's using the V-carve bit and just by adjusting the depth on the path in which it's going. So if we look at something, this is the most recent version of it. It's basically just the bit itself is just traveling down a path, moving downwards, which you could set up in the software. You can see I forgot to change the path direction on one part of it. But you can sort of see, you know, the idea of how can we really begin to engage this technology in ways that maybe the pantograph wasn't even intended for, or that they might have used stamping to sort of do this kind of work. And really thinking about, I've probably said this 100 times, how, like the merging of technology with sort of these older technologies of making wood type. And so this is where this typeface is now. Here's the previous version in a 10 line, and also really kind of playing around with what happens if I carve in a little bit more to create the border shapes. Obviously, it's the brush version's a little bit of a positive, and then here we have it where it's cut into relief and negative. And you can also see here a little bit of experimentation with the different depths in which it's kind of carving into it. Different tool bits as well are part of that experimentation. Here's a little bit of my sort of sample board carved in some found wood that we pulled out of our basement years ago. But thinking about what happens if I go for a 1/4 inch in to 0.2 inches to 0.1 inch, and what does that look like in terms of depth and material as it travels over that path? And these paths are just going in one direction, whereas these are kind of going in two directions to kind of make that carve to it and designing accordingly. This is what that most recent one looks like printed in terms of, again, thinking about that border. Are there ways we can kind of play around with that cap itself, playing around with some ornamentation? Oddly, this was a lot easier to figure out how to do C's and O's to a degree than this version here, and I haven't figured out why it was so much easier. I think because it's a little bit more decorative and I can adjust the paths a little bit more, but that's so much more what that looks like. And what this looks like too in terms of actually the file itself, this is the file itself. This is what the Illustrator file looks like. It's sort of flat. And in order to really see it, I either simulate it in the carving software or just by sort of adjusting, you know, making custom brushes in Illustrator so that I could really get a sense of how that type might work when it's being carved, figuring out what is that depth for it. So that's sort of my work in kind of a quick nutshell. I'm still experimenting with all of this work, sometimes doing some commission work here and there. This is just some recent work that was kind of based on the commission, but I miscut some letters, so I actually have them here. But it is a 12-line version of this particular typeface, as well as the little halftone dots. And these are all sorts of weird things. I don't know if anybody can notice in the stream itself, but you'll notice that the halftone dots are slightly oval, not necessarily 100% circular. And so there's all sorts of little nuances that you have to learn about your sort of machine. My machine has a hard time making perfect tiny circles. It's not bad at making circles at large scale, but for some reason, making circles on a smaller scale, I think it's just the threshold in which it can move. So a tighter machine might work. But here we have, so you have like some circles. This is where it's miscut. My guides were slightly off on the trim saw, and unfortunately had to kind of redo the entire thing for that person. So that's the work. I think up next, and I'm going to switch it back to my front camera. Up next, you'll have Dafi Cooney. Hopefully you've enjoyed me talking about my process.
Okay.
Thank you, Ryan. That's really interesting how you're, in a sense, going against sort of contemporary typeface design, where the only thing you're interested in is a linear line, where when you work in three-dimensionally, it's totally different. But we'll catch up with the questions after. We've got to now go to Dafi's pre-recorded film, so we'll run that one and catch up at the end.
Welcome to my studio. My name is Dafi Kühne. I'm a designer and letterpress printer from Zurich, Switzerland. We are here at my studio in Nevels. Let me show you a little bit of that. So, some laser cut stuff, some cast plastic resin, some chipboard type, pantograph cut plastic and wood, some more laser cut stuff. When I was a student at Zurich University of the Arts, I had the opportunity to make an internship with Hat Show Print in Nashville, Tennessee. And that was the greatest thing I could do at that time. So we would typeset and print posters with movable type, traditional wood type, and we got in touch with all this crazy material that they had in their archive. So once I got back to Zurich, I just wanted to do this, and I wanted to produce wood type with the laser cutter that we had at the school. So I started making my first sets. These were made with two components. I basically cut a thin sheet of beech wood, and I also engraved the position on the body, so I could basically just mount them on the body where they need to be on the solid piece. And together the two pieces would add up to type height. I used beech wood at that time because it was the cheapest available and still good in quality. I also made these 4 characters, as well as this 3-set chromatic shaded, and I cut the solid one as close as possible so I could typeset them as regular type, but then I could also fit them into the the shadow if I space them out. So I showed these letters to my professor, and I thought he would totally freak out and love that. He was a letterpress guy. So I showed it to him and he said, well, this is great, but what's new about it? And I said, well, the tool is new. I can do this digitally and it's much easier, much faster. And he said, well, that's interesting, but what is it really we could do with this tool that we couldn't have done with the pantograph or traditional production methods? So for my diploma project, I really dived into also the concept of wood type. So is poster type in the 20th century still movable pieces of type? Or is it maybe just reusable pieces of type, or maybe just recyclable pieces of type? So I made a lot of experiments with MDF, very fragile objects, but also plexiglass. And also use different tools. For example, the vinyl cutter mounted the vinyl letters onto pieces of type. I documented the whole thing in a newspaper as well as in an online catalog. This is the newspaper I printed with some of the experimental blocks. In 2009, the project was called Wood Type Now. And again, it was not all movable type at all. It was just new ways of printing or manufacturing blocks for the letterpress printing press. Here I used strings wrapped around some laser cut type. So after I finished my diploma, I didn't have access to the laser cutter anymore. So I built up my studio here and I had to find new ways for making type to make my posters. So for example, I used vinyl stickers to make this poster here. And let me show you the finished poster. This was the finished poster printed with vinyl stickers. So it all came out of a necessity that I needed to find a way to make type. Or for example, this that I printed with vertical strips of chipboard. There's also an episode of the printing show where I'm showing this in detail. Then in 2012, I had the opportunity to buy a pantograph, and it just came out of a stamp manufacturer, and they had it in their office space. Like, this is how we used to make stamps, and they sold it in 2012. They gave it to me for 150 Swiss francs. So buying a pantograph is really not that hard. It's something that was used in the steel industry a lot, and they all have CNC routers now. They used to make keys and doorbell signs with pantographs. So pantograph routers were not something that was just for the printing industry. It was used in many other industries. So pantographs, I paid 150 Swiss francs for that's $150 for my pantograph. But then I had to buy all the different routers, and I had to figure out which routers work for making wood type, and I had to figure out all the materials I needed to make proper type. I prepared a little clip on how I use my pantograph. You see here on the right side, I put in a pattern or an original set or piece of wood type. And on the left side, I use a board of pear wood. And then I follow the stencil or the pattern on the right side. Here I'm following another piece of wood type. I just make a 1-to-1 copy, and the router makes the exact same movement, and I cut. So suddenly I had a way to make my own type, and I could even borrow type from old printers that they didn't want to sell me and make a copy. And that's exactly what I did with this poster here. Let me go over here. So this is a set of wood type that I borrowed from an old printer, and I just made copies of the type. And here we see the final poster. And compared to the old type, of course, the new type prints perfectly well. I also had to figure out the material I used for making the type. So I made type from pear wood. This is steam-treated pear wood with shellac. And very soon I found out that pear wood is great, but it's really expensive. This plastic is super dense and prints even better, and doesn't warp at all, never. And the type height, I can just order the boards perfectly cut to type height. So that's how I made these letters here. These are cut from plastic, pantograph cut from plastic. I used, this is Block by Berthold. I used an original letter. I traced it and made an exact 1-to-1 copy in plastic. The original was made in wood that I had for this one. Let me show you some more posters. This poster I printed with a pantograph cut set of wood type, but the original set was a little bit too big. I couldn't print the poster with the original type. You see the letters were too big and they wouldn't fit on the format. So I had to scale the letters down by something like 10% so they would fit the final format. Or then the Helsinki poster. I needed to trim down some of the letters so they would fit on the press. So this would run off the press. So I had to trim down the letters or even the bodies of the letters. And I didn't want to do this with the original wood type, but I made copies and then I could just trim them down. Then in 2015, I had the chance to buy a laser cutter for my studio. And again, this totally changed my approach for making type. I mean, I had some experience with the laser cutter from my diploma project from 2009, but now I had it in my studio and I could just do whatever I wanted with it here. So for example, for this poster, and you can see it's about Renaissance painting. This is Mona Lisa, that's the most obvious. This is Judith and Holofernes. This is, well, hard to see. This is Venus, but this is Bacchus. Maybe you can see a person drinking wine on this one. So I cut diffusion dither, pixel 4-tone halftone or 4-color halftone photo plates if you want. It's laser cut pear wood also. And now with the new methods, I could also combine the laser cutter with the pantograph. For example, in this poster here, this poster, I wanted to compose it with movable blocks. So I first cut some laser cut stencils or patterns from the very cheap wood, and then I engraved them into pear wood so I could compose it also together with the physical type I had. But mainly the pantograph has one huge advantage over the laser cutter or even a CNC router. If I want a CNC router, or if I want a laser cut a piece of wood type, a copy of a piece of wood type, I have to vectorize this. And well, it's a standard job, but the problem is the curves on an original piece of wood type are very often not symmetric. So we have this curve. Is it symmetric to that curve? Is it symmetric to that curve, or this curve down here? So the problem is, if I vectorize that, I start drawing the path, the Bezier curve, and I realize, oh, this curve is different. Now, was it intended to be different? That we don't know. Or was it just bad skills of the person who operated the pantograph, or even the person who cut the pattern? So it's always a question if we want to correct this, or if we want to stick with the original. Now, if we stick with the original and let's say, okay, this is asymmetric, that's fine. Let's vectorize it the same way as we see it. It looks a little weird on the digital sketch. It doesn't look perfect. But then if we correct it and say, let's say we copy this side of the letter to the other side of the letter, then it looks too perfect. And if I cut a copy with the pantograph directly from an original piece, I don't even have to ask myself this question. I make an exact copy of this physical piece of type. In 2016, I was working on a project for my book, TruePrint. You can see it over here, where I wanted to print a poster with a 36-point type, metal type face, and I didn't have enough letters to produce that. So I somehow had to find a way to reproduce metal type. The pantograph was not suitable for such small sizes. I didn't have such small routers, though the pantograph could theoretically do that, but I didn't have the routers, and it's also a ton of work if you need something like 400 or 500 letters. It's way too much. So I developed this technique of casting copies of metal type. Let me show you how I do this. So here you see me mounting some letters with double-sided tape in a little box that I'm building, and then I'm filling this up with silicone. So here I'm making the mold to then cast the plastic type later. Then I pull out the original type that I later can also combine with the plastic type. Here I'm casting the plastic type with a plastic resin into the molds. Then I can pull out each individual letter, and I can reuse the molds. And then I can typeset just as I did before. I have to trim down the bodies, which I can do on a trim saw. If I properly adjust it, it takes me about 2 or 3 letters to properly adjust the saw. And then once it is adjusted, I just lock it and I can trim down the letters. And they work just fine. So the type on this poster was all printed with cast plastic type. And let me show you some physical type. Also cast smaller type. And here you see a lockup. That's mold, and this is a form that I just cast. So the casting is a really interesting technique that I can use if I'm missing some smaller characters, mainly metal type. I have to say, to develop this technique, it took me about 2 weeks of experimenting with different plastics until I had it all done. To also cast the whole set, I had an assistant casting for 2 weeks. Those 500 letters, we cast them together. It took us forever. So is it economically feasible? Not really. But if you only need, let's say, 5 more letters, totally. If you need to cast full sets, it will take you forever. At the beginning of this year, I've been working for another poster for the band Über You, the same band that I've been working with the copies of the wood type a couple of years ago. And I needed something that was really rough visually. So I tried out making type with vertical chipboard. And here you see some of the results. But still, I mean, I really enjoyed the results for a while, but it just wasn't fitting the concept. And for me, that's really important in my work, that I'm trying to find ways to produce posters that fit a certain concept. So even if I find something that is visually attractive but not fitting the cause, I might put it aside and maybe use this later. What I finally came up with was this poster here. And I have to say, recently I really got into, or over the last years, I really got into hand cutting linoleum. And this is hand cut linoleum that is then engraved with the laser cutter. Let me show you a very short video extract of how I made this poster. So here you see me cutting the linoleum for the first color, the black. Then I put it on the press, and I first print the black type. So then I put the white hand-cut linoleum on the press. And I think I printed this twice to get it real covering. Now, the interesting thing here is I want a combination between hand-cut and laser-cut blocks. So I used the exact same block, the hand-cut block, and I put it on the laser cutter. And here I'm engraving into the hand-cut linoleum, I'm engraving the halftones, or the halftone patterns. And then once this is cut, I put the same block just in the same position on the press, and without even setting the position, it's just there. It's perfectly on because I didn't move the block. And then I print the halftones onto the white. Now if we look at the poster again, you can see the halftones are far from perfect. They're really, really rough. I mean, if I wanted a perfect photo print, I would definitely not engrave linoleum with the laser cutter. You can see how rough these halftones are. But that's part of the quality of this poster. That's what I really like about this process. So for me, the very interesting point about working with letterpress is that each tool that I use has a different trace. And if I use a laser cutter, it looks different. There's a different transformation of my design to a physical block than if I hand cut it. So I make a design, and then there's a certain transformation into the physical block that will print differently depending on the tool that I use. And I try to use the tools wherever they fit. Now, sometimes this is traditional wood type, and sometimes this is something that is not even movable type. And as I mentioned before, maybe movable type or maybe poster type is not only physical wood type anymore in the 21st century, but maybe just something that is reusable or just recyclable. So thank you very much for inviting me. If you're interested in more of my work, definitely visit my webpage. Maybe watch the printing show. You'll find it on Vimeo. You'll also find other talks of me on Vimeo. Just go through my channel. If you're interested in studying with me, well, maybe you should look into typographicSummerProgram.ch. That's a thing. All right, thanks a lot for having me here at Letterpress United. Unite! Bye.
Cool. Thank you very much, Duffy. And thanks. Really three interesting, diverse approaches to the same subject. What we're going to do now, just as we gather our thoughts, is just open it. If anyone's got any specific questions, I noticed there were one or two that I've written down during the presentations. If you want to ask them again, we'll try and meet up with the speakers and just give them the opportunity to run through that. We'll probably do this for about 10 minutes because I didn't realize we've been broadcasting for over an hour. So just to come to some kind of conclusion. So if you want to ask, please do.
Okay, I'm letting the speaker again into the live stream. So thank you again, guys. It's, yeah, your work, it's inspiring. Thank you. So okay,
John Christopher asked Daffy, what's the smallest size you can cast? Smallest point size?
Well, I cast down to around 16 points. I would even do maybe 14 or 12. Again, it's not a question of the technology, because the casting technology of plastics is so far evolved these days. If you have the right tools, you can go probably even smaller. But bubbles is a problem, and you could avoid bubbles by casting in a vacuum, which I didn't have access to a vacuum chamber, but that would help, especially if you go smaller. The more details you have, the more bubbles you get. But also, one thing that is really important about a casting process in general is a casting process theoretically always takes the same amount of time, no matter how detailed the faces are. As compared to a routing process, it will take you longer the more details you get as Ryan explained us before. So that's very interesting about the casting process.
Mm-hmm. And Ryan, do you, when you set the path of the router, do you set it to relate to the direction of the wood grain?
I've experimented with it. Well, I'm cutting everything end grain, so there's not really any. You don't have to pay attention to the grain as much in that case. So since I'm cutting it end grain, it's not that bad. And I've done some experimentations because a lot of the work I'm doing is fairly detailed. The bit has to move relatively slow, or else you're kind of going to get blowouts and chips and whatnot. And because it's moving so slow, I haven't really noticed if there's a much difference between what they call a conventional path or a climbing path, which is just one going counterclockwise, one going clockwise. I don't know if Mark's experienced anything along those lines, or Daffy, but I haven't experienced anything, that really matters on the CNC because it's moving slow.
Well, on the pantograph, or at least on my pantograph, because I'm cutting 1-to-1 very often, you get a lot of force on the tracer side or on the pattern side. If you cut 1-to-5, so then you would experience less force. So for me, it is important that the first cut, I do it, let me think, counterclockwise, the cut around the edge, because that pulls me towards the face. If I cut clockwise, it pushes me off from the face or from the edge. So it's important. On the router, there's really certain things that I had to learn, and I had nobody who would explain me the machine, so I had to find that out.
Mm-hmm. What was someone asked what the plastic was. Is it corian?
Yeah.
The plastic that I'm using is called POMC. That's a polyethylene whatever thing. And it's just basically, I called the plastic suppliers and I said, can you send me samples of all the materials that you have that I can work with woodworking routers? And they said, well, it's these 4 or whatever they send. And I did tests on each, and I found out this stuff is the best. And then I asked them, how can you, what kind of sizes can you deliver? And they said, whatever you want. We are going to route them on a CNC, on a huge CNC router anyway. So they route them to perfect type height, and they're ready to cut.
Right, cool. What's that? There's a question there from Greg. It says, what material do you use for your laser cut patterns?
Well, the laser cut patterns, I normally use whatever I have, like some cheap MDF or something like that. Just something that doesn't, I mean, I wouldn't use chipboard because it might be too soft with the patterns. If you touch it with whatever tool, it will get a dent. So I use MDF that's pretty dense, maybe 3 or 4 millimeters, whatever I have available.
And Ryan, what's your actual relationship to the final print? Because I know in like looking at Daffy's work, Daffy's after, if you're printing in bright red, you want a solid bright red. Is that something that informs your process or not?
I think it's informed some of my process. At least with the chromatics, like in this case, like for example, this thing here, all of the prototyping was based on sort of cyan, yellow, and red, or magenta. I at one time added black in there, and it just got really crazy heavy dents. So in some cases, I do have some relationship to the final print. In other cases, it's more about the form of the block and experimenting with the type itself.
Yeah, because in a funny way, it is the elephant in the room. Is we're all using this equipment that has the marks of age, and some people are comfortable with printing it knowing there's some kind of deformity or scratches or defects, and other people, what they do is they try and push it through the paper to make up for that, or you generate new work, or you generate new items, which both of you are sort of embracing, really. So it's quite an interesting one. How do you not use very much older elements, Daffy? Now,
well, I do. The thing is here that with where I'm from in Switzerland, nobody cares for. I'm a graphic designer. Nobody would care for the surface texture of used wood type. I could use this possibly in one poster if I'm talking about something that is rough or loud or whatever I want to say, if the message is correct. But I could not make a living out of using or working with old materials, and that's and I don't want to criticize anybody who does, but it's just, for me, it's not possible. So I have to find ways to produce designs that can keep up with all the other designs that I see out in real life. So that's why I have a lot of old equipment and I use it, but I have to use it very carefully.
Okay, we have another question for Daffy. Can I find your Halfton laser cut settings anywhere?
No. So I think it's the same with Ryan when he showed us his test blocks. And even if I give you settings for how I use the settings on my machine, you use a different machine, you use different wood, or maybe your wood has a different moisture and it's completely different. So, or your lens is dirty. So all I need to do, I don't even note down the depth of what I did. I do a little test every day when I laser something, and I know roughly, or pretty much know how this stuff works. So it's all about trying out, using, there's no rule for that, basically. I think Ryan would agree to that, right?
Right, especially if you use like maker spaces as well, because you have no idea when the last time they cleaned it. So every time when I would go in to laser etch type, it's even worse at school, you know, because students are also using it. You know, you want to make sure that it's focused, the focus is set accordingly, and then it's cleaned. And I would try to go in like in the mornings when I knew it would be clean. But yeah, you still have to test every time. And I did agree, like some blocks might have a little bit more moisture than others, and that can completely change how it etches. So yeah, you do have to just be prepared. Any digital fabrication, a lot of testing.
That's a good advice. Thank you. And also in the comments, I see someone is writing about 3D print. I know it's not been a topic in this streaming today, but have you something to say about it? 3D printed type, or okay.
Well, you go ahead. You go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried a handful of. I've tried the PLA. I didn't care for the texture that it left on the surface itself, and then I've tried using a resin 3D printer to kind of do some really small work. I made a really small version of that zigzag using a resin printer, which had much better results. But you know, to get a letter this big, you know, takes like an hour and just doesn't seem efficient at all. But yeah, and I think you know, Richard, I think it's Richard Ardo, is at New North Press, and his Etude 3D. I mean, that's a fantastic example of a resin printed 3D typeface. So it's possible. I just personally, you know, I'm already like trying to find ways to speed up a CNC, and there's no way you could speed up a 3D printer. So.
And I just want to say that that sample that you were or the example of Richard doing the 3D printed type, that typeface was designed for 3D printing. And that's what I think is interesting. And that's what I think is so interesting about Ryan's work also, that he designs his typefaces so they work with the CNC router or whatever he uses. And that's what I think wouldn't work if you just say, oh, I have this typeface, it's the latest typeface from whatever digital foundry, and now I want to make this physical type. Honestly, I don't see a reason for that, because the old type was designed to fit on a body, and it was designed to be hand composed. And now if you just use any digital face that you have on your system and make it physical type, it doesn't even look good. And then I would say, why don't you just cut it with a laser cutter and you mount it freely with tape on a board, and then you don't need these stupid bodies and the type system and all this shit. Sorry for that. If you want to work free, then please work free. Freedom to the people.
What do you think? I briefly touched on it after Ryan finished speaking. The fact that he chose to make the sort of modular thing that wasn't a linear thing where did that thinking come about? Because it is so far from how you design type. If you're using Fontographer or Glyphs or something like that, you still design type, even though it's digitally, in a linear fashion, sitting it horizontally adjacent to the next piece. So that was like for you, that was a massive leap. If like, oh no, you can do this in this new module.
I think a lot of it comes about, well, you can't always leave the machine and the equipment. So even when you're CNC routing, you're sitting next to it, because there's always going to be that one time that the bit decides to stray off and ruin an entire block or who knows what. So you want to be there. And I think a lot of it's just sitting there, and at some point, particularly when I was doing the really more detailed work, that just takes a tremendous amount of time to cut. I was like, how can I speed this up? And then, kind of along the lines of what Dafi is talking about, I could easily cut any face digitally, but then I'm not really sort of embracing the machine. And I really kind of was just interested in thinking about, what is the language of this particular machine? Like, if it was to draw a font and make it. And so that's, partly boredom and staring at the router trying to understand it is really where it kind of came about.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Maybe we have time for one last question. Dafi, outside of your typographic summer program, do you offer internships?
Currently not. I do have interns from time to time, but they can only come in 1 day a week. That's the deal I have with them. So it's not very attractive for international interns. I'm sorry for that.
Okay, so just wait another minute for any last questions from the audience, and let's see. Okay, we have been streaming for an hour and a half. Okay, so
I think that's it. I think, well, there's still an opportunity for people, if they think of anything, they can write in the comments on the YouTube or in the Facebook group thereafter, and then we can try and sort of answer those as we can. But it's been thank you ever so much for being part of this first season 2. We didn't really know what to expect, and it's such a diverse range of approaches to the same singular problem in effect, but it's great for it, and you guys are really helping to sort of push the envelope of what people produce and their relationship to it, and maintaining something that's 500 years out of date, really. It's cool, great to be part of it. And thank you ever so much for the audience to sort of tuning in. I hope it was valuable. We're still working out what the date of the next one will be, but we'll post that on the Facebook group once we know. So just keep an eye on the update. But we can sign off. And
yeah, of course. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. Right. Cheers.